All right, hello everyone. We are going to be discussing mainly India today. However, I do have a few slides towards the end of these presentations that are also going to talk about Southeast Asia in period 3. So let's get started. All right, so political centralization was not very common in South Asia. And when the Gupta dynasty collapsed in 550 CE, remember that from period 2 in case you forgot, India remains decentralized for the next 1,000 years or so. And throughout that period of decentralization, northern and southern India developed very separate political structures. And you see that local rulers in all parts of the Indian subcontinent create strong power bases for themselves. And the power of these local rulers makes it very difficult for centralized rule to exist, but easy for wars to occur. And at the end of this period, the Mughal Empire rises. This happens in the 16th century. And that finally brings peace and stability to the region. And that is actually a dynasty of Muslims who were ruling India, but we will hold off on talking about the Mughals until we get to period 4. All right, so in terms of political structures in southern India, we see more stability than in northern India. There are some periods where centralized governments succeed in overcoming the regional politics that were common for India in this period after the Gupta. So we see that the Chola Kingdom is one example of that, and then also the Vijayanagar Kingdom, which exists after that. They both are in the same part of India, so the southern tip of the Indian subcontinent, as well as the island of Ceylon, which is present-day Sri Lanka. So we'll start with the Chola Kingdom. This was around from the 9th to the 13th century CE, and it reigned over India, therefore, for over 400 years. And in the 11th century, the kingdom extended its rule. It used to just rule in India proper, but then it extended its rule into Ceylon, which I said earlier is now called Sri Lanka. So the geographic location of the Chola Kingdom allowed its navy to access the waterways of both the Indian Ocean as well as the Bay of Bengal. So it was a very good trading location. And the Chola Kingdom represented the height of the Indian Ocean trade. Chola ships traveled as far east as the South China Sea, and this was more than 3,000 miles away. The Chola Kingdom's power starts to decline when people who were native to Ceylon start to drive out the Chola people. So essentially you see that there's still inner conflict. The people that lived in Ceylon did not want to be ruled by the Chola Kingdom, and this ultimately leads to the decline of Chola's power. The Chola is then reduced to a smaller, more regional kingdom, and ultimately then it will fall. But I thought that this visual was significant because we can see that at its height, the Chola Kingdom, it had influence over most of Southeast Asia in addition to South Asia. Then the Vijayanagar Kingdom. This exists from the 13th to the 15th century CE. This is founded by two brothers from the Delhi Sultanate, and we'll talk about the Delhi Sultanate in more detail in just a few moments here. The two brothers were named Harihara and Bhuka, and they are sent from northern India, the Delhi Sultanate, to southern India. These two men were born Hindu, but then they convert to Islam because they wanted upward mobility. Once they establish the new kingdom, the Vijayanagara kingdom, they end up converting back to Hinduism, so to the religion of their birth. And the Vijayanagar kingdom existed from the mid-1300s until the mid-1500s, and then it is overthrown by Muslims. And after that, we see the rise of the Mughal Empire in northern and central India. Again, we'll talk about that in period 3. All right, in northern India, we see that there's a lot more upheaval. So if there was, let's say, a comparative essay that wanted to look at political structures throughout India, you certainly need to stress the idea that the Vijayanagar and the Chola kingdoms of the south are much more stable than, let's say, the Delhi Sultanate in the north. Okay, so the Himalayas, as we remember, do provide a natural barrier that somewhat protects India from outside invasions, but there still were passes in the mountains. So most notably, there was the Khyber Pass and the Hindu Kush Pass. So there were ways that particularly Turkish-speaking peoples could pass and invade the Indian subcontinent. So this often happened when politics were not particularly stable in India, so that outside invaders could sort of take advantage of that vulnerability. There were 4 separate invasions by Muslim armies throughout the post-classical period, and each of these attacks creates more instability and disruption. So this region before the post-classical period was virtually entirely Hindu and Buddhist. But then during period 3, what we start to see is that the Muslim influence increases, and it is certainly there to stay by the end of this historical period. So after each invasion that we see Islam and its influence grow increasingly. I know that this map is way too hard to see because the key is so small, but ultimately this is just showing us different Arab campaigns into India, right? So this is actually the Himalayan mountain range. This is the Indian subcontinent, which is cut off. And then this is actually showing us the political fragmentation that existed in the Indian subcontinent. As we can see, there are a number of different groups and small regions within the Indian subcontinent. So by no means was it politically unified. Okay, so one example of some unification in northern India was when Harsha ruled in the 7th century. So he was a king, and he restored some unified rule in northern India. Part of this was because he was a very strong military leader. He had a military that had over 20,000 cavalry, over 50,000 infantry, and then 5,000 war elephants. So at the very least, some intimidation there. Harsha was a Buddhist, but he was also tolerant of other faiths that existed within his kingdom. And he worked to distribute wealth in his kingdom, but his attempts to maintain a unified northern empire do eventually fail. Part of this is because the local leaders don't like the fact that they're losing power to Harsha, and eventually Harsha is assassinated. This happens in 648 CE, and he dies without a living heir. So after that, northern India returns to local rule. Again, we see examples of Muslims invading the Indian subcontinent throughout its history, which ultimately has the long-term effect of instilling Islam in that region. So, if we go back to the 8th century, the Umayyad dynasty invaded in the region of Sindh, which is here in present-day Pakistan. And the Umayyad incursion in this region did not really change the everyday lives of the Hindus, Muslims, and Zoroastrians that lived in that region. My apologies, I said Muslim. I meant to say it did not dramatically alter Hindu, Buddhist, and Zoroastrian culture. So sorry about that typo there. But in any case, what you see is that despite the fact that there is this Umayyad invasion in India, the regional rulers, the princes that already existed, maintain most of their power. The geographic region of Sindh, it's on the eastern fringes of the Muslim world, of the Dar al-Islam, which is sort of where the pointer is, right? This is the Abbasid Caliphate region here. In any case, the fact that it was so far east kept it isolated from the rest of the empire, so it did not really adopt as many of the cultural practices as the rest of the Muslim world. So eventually, once the Abbasid Caliphate collapses, Hindu authority returns, but technically the caliphs of both the Abbasid and the other way around, of both the Umayyad and the Abbasid Caliphate do rule nominally in this region. And the Abbasid Caliphate doesn't fall until 1258 CE. So what we do see here really is that there's mainly still local rule, but a Muslim influence in this region. You also have some invasions. Muslims invade India in the 11th century as well. So these invasions were led by Mahmud of Ghazni, Ghazni, my apologies. He conquers the Punjab region of India, which is in present-day Pakistan and Afghanistan. And what he does is he takes advantage of the conflicts that already existed between local leaders. And Mahmud's armies plundered northern India's Hindu temples and Buddhist holy sites. And so what this does is that it actually makes Islam less favorable to the people that witness these events. I don't know if Mahmud's intent was to try to attract people to Islam, but this really left a bad taste in people's mouths. They were not particularly happy with this destruction, so he was less successful in converting people to Islam as he might have hoped. But what we do see is that the destruction of many of these monuments leads to the decline of Buddhism in particular. Hindu remains strong just because of sheer numbers. So 150 years after Mahmud's death, his successors managed to conquer the city of Delhi, which is the present-day capital of India, but it was also the it was the capital, rather, of the Delhi Sultanate. And once that happens, the Delhi Sultanate is born. So this is a northern Indian kingdom that shows that there is finally going to be some political unification in India. So the Delhi Sultanate lasts for 300 years, from the 13th to the 16th century CE. Delhi is located here in north-central India, and it was the Sultan's seat of power. So this also shows us that politics are starting to centralize. The Sultanate did have a bureaucracy, but it was not nearly as efficient as, let's say, the Chinese. So this makes it difficult for the sultans to impose their policies in a land like India, which was so vast and so diverse. So what we see is that despite the fact that the Delhi Sultanate was ruled by Muslims, Hindu influence still remained strong in the region, and Hindus still ruled locally. So the power of the Delhi Sultanate did not really extend farther beyond its capital, which means that technically the Delhi Sultanate was all this land, but once you get past the actual city, it was still local business as usual for the most part. So what we do see again is that under periods of Muslim rule, the Hindu influence remained strong. Again, like I just said, the Hindus still rule locally, and the sultans attempted to extend their rule to southern India, but by the late 13th century, they become more focused on defense, because what they find is that the Mongols are starting to invade. As we know from previous empires, those pesky Mongols come in. So even though the Mongols never successfully conquer India, they still are trying to. So the sultans of the Delhi Sultanate are turning their attention northward instead of southward, which explains why the Delhi Sultanate does not expand much farther south than it does here. At this point, the Mongols had already demolished the Abbasid Empire. It had destroyed its capital city of Baghdad. And we also know, like I just said, that the Mongols never conquered South Asia, but the sultans of Delhi also did not maintain control of northern India forever. So clearly there was a concern when the Mongols were invading that they were going to lose that power. So what happens eventually, as I've mentioned a few times, is that despite the fact that the Mongols don't conquer India, the Mughals, which are Muslims from outside of India, end up eventually ruling it. This is really period 4 in our course, but just to mention it, and this really shows us the height of Muslim rule in India. As you hopefully are aware, India is, at this point, much more of a Hindu-dominated country. This also has modern reasons. We'll talk about those much more when we get into period 6 and talk about the imperial era. But in any case, I get ahead of myself. What you see is that the presence of Islam in northern India dominated the political history of the era. To a large extent, one could say that these outsiders, these foreign rulers, might have created some resentment among Indians that had lived there for centuries, people that were Hindu. They don't like the fact that suddenly these non-Hindus are ruling them. And a good tangible example of that was the jizya, which was a tax that non-Muslims had to pay. So this did have the effect of converting some people. They converted because they didn't want to pay the tax. But it wasn't the same as some other areas that we see in the Muslim world that converted more willingly. So despite the strong Muslim presence in the region, again, like I've said multiple times, I know I'm repeating myself, but that probably means something, that local kingdoms continue to play a major role in India's decentralized political landscape. All right, so we're going to stop here and we're going to pick up with the economy of India, and then we're also going to talk about South Asia in the next video. So stay tuned.